Okay, so this is task number 2 of the 2015 pre-release material. A couple of things to bear in mind in this question. We need to record the weights of students on the last day of term. Okay, we then need to do a calculation and we need to store the difference in weight for each of the pupils. Now, we're going to need an array for this because we know there's 30 students. But the knowing the question doesn't say we need to store the weight of students on the last day of term. So I'm going to create an array in order to store the differences, but then I'm just going to have a single variable that allows us to take in the weights on the last day of term, which we obviously need in order to calculate the difference. Now, I'm not going to recreate all of the additional arrays that we used in task number 1, nor am I going to recreate the variables that were required. I'm just going to focus on creating any new variables or new arrays in task number 2, and any other variables I've used, I'll just initialize them as and when they are required. So to start off with, I need a array for the weight difference. Okay, so there's the array for the weight difference, and there's the variable to hold the end weight. I know I'm going to have to firstly take in all the weights on the last day of term. So I'm going to need a for loop for this. Again, I'm using a for loop because I already know how many times we're going to run through the loop. So it makes sense to use a for versus the other loops like the while or the repeat loop. I need to initialize count to 1, so I know I'm working on the first index of the array. Otherwise, it simply won't work its way through the loop. So I've initialized count as 1. Okay, a couple of things to have a look over here. First thing is I've put end-to-end weight, and then in brackets I've put kilos, something I didn't do in task number 1, but it just makes it a bit more clearer for the user as to what it is in terms of the the kilos is that we're looking for, rather than things like stone or some other type of weight. And then I've put in a student name, which is the array from the previous task number 1, again making it a bit easier for the user so that they already know in advance what student they're looking for when they're entering the end weight in. Now I need to make sure that the weight that they enter in meets the validation that we would accept for for this particular question. So I'm just going to start off by doing an if statement and making sure that any information that they do enter meets the criteria that we require. Okay, so in this section, I've again made it very clear that there's an error. I've informed the user of the values that are acceptable. And then I've informed the user that they're gonna have to go back and re-enter. I have moved count back to -1 because at the end of this loop, there's gonna be a next count. So by taking one away from count and then adding one back to count later on, they're essentially on the same index within the array, that way allowing them to re-enter. Now, if this condition hasn't been met, it means that the values are correct. So what we then want to do is calculate the difference by using the end weight variable and the start weight array. And then we want to store that in the weight difference array. And then we just want to move back through the loop and do that for the next set of students. So I'm just going to finish off this by adding the else statement. Okay, so I've calculated the weight difference by taking the end weight and then taking the original start weight away from that. Now this is going to cause us a slight problem, which we'll look at in task number 3, which is if the end weight was, for argument's sake, 25, the end weight was 25 and the start weight was 35, that's going to mean that we're going to end up with a minus figure because they've lost weight. And from a user interface point of view, we want to be very careful about how we explain that information to the user. So we want to be looking at options that allow us, when we tell the user that they've lost weight, that we don't say that they've lost -10 weight, but they've lost 10. So we'll look at how we might tackle that in task number 3. But that's everything that meets the criteria for task number 2.